Howdy, humanities 2. This is, I think, lecture 17. We're into our first week of October. The weather's starting to get cool out there, which is nice. Finally, smoke is still out there, but they're getting it under control. It's supposed to rain in a couple of days, but we'll see if that happens. Hope you guys are hanging in there. I'm going to continue our discussion about rock and roll. The other day, I talked up to essentially the 50s. Now I want to go a little further on. Maybe your parents know this stuff. They grew up with it. Your grandparents. I don't know how old you are. I assume you're younger than me. But I was there. I was 12 years old when the Beatles were on Ed Sullivan, and it changed the entire shape of my generation's universe. You may be sick of the Beatles. You may not understand what the big deal was, but it was a revolution. We never seen anything like it. Yes, they were clean-cut boys, but they had long hair, very neatly trimmed, of course, and they wore suits and ties, and they bowed when they performed. They came on the Ed Sullivan. There was a lot of hype around it. We heard about it. We'd had one record here already, but we'd had no idea what they kind of look like because this is long before YouTube and social networking. In those days, we simply didn't know. We only read about it. Beetle Mania was a very big deal in England at least a year before they came here, say all of 63. They came here in January 1964. To put a global perspective on it, in November, John F. Kennedy, our president, was assassinated. That's November 63, folks, a day of reckoning. And he was our youngest president we ever had, our most kind of rock and roll president. He looked cool in a convertible, let me tell you, compared to the old fogies we had before. And he had captured the positive outlook the country had. They actually had, when he was in the presidency, they called it Camelot. That's from a mythological. There was no Camelot, folks. That's a myth, but that's how good we felt about ourselves. The country was prosperous. People are in school. People are going to college more than ever. We'd come close to a missile crisis in Cuba, and Kennedy averted it. Russia was shipping nuclear missiles to Cuba, which is only 90 miles off the Florida shore. And we caught wind of it and we stopped them. We sent our ships out there and we stopped it. And for a few moments, Russia and the U.S. had their fingers on the button. These nuclear devices did not have a way to detonate themselves, but we found out that they're going to put these missile sites on Cuba, and we weren't going to allow that. And so we put the kibosh on it. Kennedy cut them off at the pass, as it were, and it saved the day. We came this close to all-out nuclear war with Russia. I was just a kid, and so we were aware of it, but we weren't that much aware of it. We were mostly watching movies and listening to our music and having a pretty good time. And then that happened, and it changed the political landscape. Also, that's a positive thing that Kennedy did, absolutely. Negative thing he did, of course, he didn't know it at the time, he got us involved in the Vietnam War. It looked like a good deal. It looked like communism was trying to spread its wings through the Southeast Asia, and we, as the purveyor of democracy weren't going to have it. And Vietnam was separated into two countries: north, the communist side, which was right by the Chinese border, and then the southern half, where Saigon was democracy. And they asked us to come in there. They needed help. They didn't have a big enough army, and so we went in, and it got us bogged down into a war that lasted about 15 years, and got over 50,000 guys my age killed, and turned out to be a huge mistake and cost a lot of lives, at least a million lives, total, because we bombed the holy hell out of that country. Civilians massacred. Uh, Most of them were not communists, by the way. They're just peaceful people, farmers, and we took the war to them in a big way. Maybe you've seen some of the movies. Maybe you've seen Apocalypse Now. Watch it. Maybe you've seen Platoon. Watch it. Maybe you've seen Full Metal Jacket. Watch it. That was my fun war. And like most good kids my age, I was against it, and I was protesting in the streets. Yes, folks, I'm sorry. That's what we did in those days. We went out on the street with our little signs that said "Students Against the War." And so that was all happening. And then all of a sudden, Ed Sullivan announces the Beatles. And it piqued our interest. And we all turned into Ed Sullivan. It was a national television phenomenon. It was a variety show that was on TV. It had been on radio before, and now it was on TV for many, many years. And in those days, folks, there's only 3 channels. Wasn't a lot of choice, and somehow we survived. I don't know how we did it, and none of it was commercial free. There was advertisements. We didn't mind because that's how it was set up. 8 o'clock every Sunday night at Sullivan. All the families in America, for the most part, would sit around the TVs to watch Ed Sullivan. And it's in black and white, of course. And later on, became in color. And we heard about the Beatles, and here comes the Beatles. And we were shocked. I remember my cousins came over to my house. They're all our age. And the girls, all my girl cousins, kind of went crazy. The boys were kind of looking at it going, what's going on? Why are the girls going so crazy? We didn't get it. The girls dug it, and they went crazy. They love those mop tops, and they love that rhythm and that beat. The boys all were looking at it and going, maybe I should grow my hair long. Maybe I should get an electric guitar and learn how to play. And so after the Beatles came on, kids in America started playing that kind of music in their garages throughout the country. People got drum sets and guitars and bass guitars, all electrified. And the folk musicians who were playing folk music stopped playing folk music, and they plugged in electric guitars. And this whole new phenomenon happened. The Beatles changed everything. And within months, there was all sorts of bands happening. A lot of it came from England. We had our own bands here. The Beach Boys were already happening. That was early on. These are bands. They weren't singers, like I told you in the last lecture, that they weren't singers fronting, the band behind them, like Elvis and Everly Brothers. They were actually bands. They played their own instruments and they sang their own songs. And here's another key to it all. They wrote their own songs. That was unheard of. The Beatles, the Beach Boys were the first bands to actually write their own music. Because in the early days, folks, nobody wanted to hear anything they hadn't heard before. And so most people did cover versions of songs that were already kind of famous sometimes, or they took songs from other songwriters and they made it their own. Elvis did that. He never wrote a song in his life. Um, a lot of them, everybody did it. Buddy Holly did write his own songs. That was unusual because the record companies wanted to sell records. How do you do that if nobody knows the songs? That's how simple-minded they were, and their vision wasn't very far forward. They just wanted to sell records. And so when the Beatles came out and they had uh, mostly original music, their first album had one or two cover songs, but they put their own stamp on it. It was a big risk. It was a calculated risk on the record company's concern, and then it paid off huge. Then everything really changed. In this country, our American Beatles was a band called the Byrds. They were from Los Angeles. Maybe you've heard of the Sunset Strip. That was happening in the 60s. And the Byrds were essentially folk musicians from the East Coast who saw the Beatles on Ed Sullivan, folks, just like the rest of us. And they decided electric guitars is the way to go. But they played their sort of folk influenced rock and roll, and they termed it folk rock. And they had their huge hit was written by Bob Dylan. And the times they are changing, and it was a huge song. And if you listen to the Byrds version and Dylan's version, they don't sound anything alike. Dylan was a folk musician, a protest singer who was starting to branch out and write his own music. He always wrote his own music, and he sang covers, everybody from Woody Guthrie to Lead Belly, and but he also started writing his own song. And his earliest songs, "Blown in the Wind," times there, the times to everything, the times they are changing. That's turn. I was going to say another song. Pete Seeger wrote that, but they started writing their own songs, and other bands started covering these songs in their own way. The Byrds put their own stamp on it, and it was folk rock coming out of the Sunset Strip, a little area. If anybody knows Hollywood, it's in West Hollywood, Upper Sunset, and there was some nightclubs up there in the early days. Some of them are still there, sort of. The Whiskey Go-Go was the main one, the Troubadour, another one, Pandora's Box, and other ones. And bands from America was starting to flourish there, like the Doors, Love, Spirit, all sorts of really interesting, eclectic West Coast bands. Up north in San Francisco, they had the whole sound that was happening in San Francisco, which was different than the sound that was happening in the Sunset Strip, which was different than what was going on in England, all based on what they saw in the Beatles. Then we had bands like the Jefferson Airplane, Moby Grape, Quicksilver Messenger Service, the Grateful Dead, and Janis Joplin, Big Brother and the Holding Company, and other bands, Country Joe and the Fish, and many, many more. It was a different what should I say? It's a different flavor of music. It was more of a peace and love hippie thing, whereas LA wasn't that way. And the people in LA, people like Frank Zappa, who came out with his first albums, did not like what he said, the stoner hippies from San Francisco. In the meantime, huge scene was happening in New York with bands like the Lovin' Spoonful, and who were very much embraced by the Beatles. And they were having hits on the radio. The British Invasion, they called it, when the Beatles led it. And the first invasion came over here. They called it that because they seemed like they were invading our country, like during the Revolutionary War. And Beatles led the charge, but there was other bands like the Rolling Stones, maybe you've heard of them. There was Herman's Hermits, maybe you've heard of them, the Dave Clark Five, the Animals, them. That first invasion was literally the soundtrack to my youth. I still love those bands to this day. I still listen to that stuff. The secondary bands of that era would be the Kinks, one of my all-time favorite bands. maybe you've heard of the song "You Really Got Me," made famous by them first, then Van Halen second. I'm going to talk about Eddie Van Halen in a second. And there's a ton of bands over there. The Zombies, really interesting. Second wave, The Who. You know, come on. You've heard of Tommy. Hopefully you've heard of it. Second wave bands like Pink Floyd and so many more. I should write this stuff down. I have, but I don't look at my notes anymore. Anyway, all these other bands from that era, Moody Blues, Procol Harum, were having huge hits over here, all stemming from the Beatles, Jerry and the Pacemakers, the Zombies, Billy J. Kramer and the Dakotas, all having hits over here, all coming and usually playing on our TV shows over here. They're not just playing at Sullivan. We had several shows here in those days, like Shindig and Hullabaloo and Where the Action Is. These were music shows to get the youthful audience to watch this stuff because our parents didn't want to watch it. They didn't like all these scruffy mop top people playing this loud, obnoxious music. And that was good for us because we should be rebelling against our parents' music. That's what it's all about. If your parents like your music, you're listening to the wrong music. I mean it. And the Beatles, I can't stress it further. They were the Mozart of their day. They were the Shakespeare of their day. They were the Picasso of their day. They changed everything. And everything falls around them. You don't have to like them. In fact, when the Beatles came out, they were not my favorite band. The Kinks were. I liked them better. For some reason, my brothers and I really took the Kinks. They were a little rougher sound, not so polished. We love the Rolling Stones. I love the Yardbirds. These are kind of rougher bands. Beatles were always a little too nice and polite. But now, of course, they cannot be denied. And the genius of Paul McCartney and John Lennon cannot be overstated. In America, we had a genius songwriter by the name of Bob Dylan, and he was changing the course of history with his music, and then he went electric. After he saw the Beatles, he plugged in his electric guitar and upset a lot of people because he was a folk singer and a protest singer, and all of a sudden he was singing genius films like oh God, I'm going to draw a blank now. Look him up. That was electric. He was booed many times. People throw stuff at him because they hated it. They didn't like the loud sounds. They wanted him to play the acoustic guitar and sing about blowing in the wind. And he wanted to sing about I Ain't Gonna Work on Maggie's Farm No More or Tangled Up in Blue, which were more complicated songs played to electric instruments. The world was changing. Then we got after the 60s, which changed everything with people like Cream and Jimi Hendrix. Things started. There was these huge festivals happening like Woodstock, Monterey Pop. We never seen these bands before, and they were getting famous off these festivals. Monterey Pop made stars out of Jimi Hendrix. We'd never seen him here. He was an American from Seattle, of all places, but he had to go to England to get famous. And then he came over here and he did Monterey Pop, and the legend was born right then and there, as was Janis Joplin and Big Brother and Home Holding Company. They'd had a pretty good following in San Francisco. Yes, they did. But the rest of the country hadn't really known about them because in those days, there was no social media to advertise yourself. And you had a tour, or if you had a hit record, you got on the radio. She didn't have that yet. When they saw her at Monterey Pop, which is right down here in Monterey, California, down by Carmel, if you know it, in 1967, it was the first essentially rock and roll pop festival put on by a bunch of rock musicians, the Mamas and Papas, helped sponsor it. Paul McCartney helped sponsor it, but the Beatles didn't play. Rolling Stones did not play. Um, by then, the Beatles weren't playing live. They stopped playing live in 1966 because they couldn't hear themselves. It was before they had sophisticated PAs like we have now, and it's just girls screaming at the top of their lungs, and they were frustrated that they couldn't play more complicated music. They all just wanted to hear the same 5 hits. I Want to Hold Your Hand, etc., and which are great songs, but they kept progressing. They're getting older, so they're writing more introspective, complicated songs influenced by Bob Dylan, and they were having trouble playing in front of audiences who could not hear the music because they're tiny amplifiers. And John Lennon goes, I could never hear my guitar. I couldn't hear myself sing. And so it was frustrating. So they went into the studio. And for the next 5 years, they only put out records, folks, that ever played live again. Except for one time. They played up on the roof. And it's a documentary of Let It Be. They played up on the roof of their building that they were recorded in. And they played about 5 songs. And they got shut down by the police. And then they broke up about within a year or so. Anyway, so here comes the 70s now, and all these people are getting the festivals are getting big, the concerts are getting bigger, and drug use is getting more prevalent. Not just marijuana and LSD, which won't kill you, folks, but bad drugs that would kill you: cocaine, speed, meth, heroin, of course. And all of a sudden, our stars became vulnerable. And in 1970, just to give you an example, within that month, Jimi Hendrix overdosed in England. He was 27 years old. Janis Joplin OD'd, overdosed, and died from heroin in Hollywood, California. She was recording her last album, Pearl, her last album she ever did, 27. A year later, in 71, Jim Morrison, the great singer from one of my favorite bands of all time, The Doors, died. We don't know what he died of. They said a heart attack. He was 27. A heart attack, really? Because in France, they don't do autopsies. They just stick you in the ground. But he had been drinking himself into oblivion and doing as much cocaine as he possibly could. And his girlfriend, Pamela, came into the apartment one day, and he was in the bathtub dead. They buried him in France. I've been to his grave, folks. It's a pilgrimage. I was in Paris. If you go to Paris, you have to go to Jim Morrison's grave. If you don't go to Paris. So all of a sudden, our heroes are dropping dead. Unbelievable. Brian Jones from the Rolling Stones in 1969. Because of drug abuse and alcohol abuse, he was fired from the Rolling Stones because he was no longer able to function. They found him drowned in his swimming pool. There's been some speculation over the years that maybe he was possibly murdered. It's never been proven. He was drowned. Now, he had asthma, and he was on all sorts of drugs, and they think maybe he had an asthma attack in the pool, and he drowned. And guess how old he was, folks? That's right, 27. And that started the what they call the 27 Club. Who else is in it? You know some people. If you like Nirvana like I did, Kurt Cobain blew his brains out at the age of 27. That's right. If you like Amy Winehouse, which I did a lot, died of alcoholism. You know how much booze you got to drink to die at 27? Well, Amy Winehouse died rough. She was a severe alcoholic, severely genius, talented woman. Tortured. She could not handle life, and so she drank and drugged like crazy. She was trying to wean herself off alcoholic, and folks, if you're an alcoholic, you can't do it cold turkey. You have to do it gradually. She just stopped, and her body said no, and her body stopped. 27 years old. Pardon me. It's the 27 Club, and there's been some other ones too you would never heard of that were a little bit obscure, like Alan Wilson from. Damn it! Sorry, I'm coughing. From Canned Heat. He was the guitar player and wrote some of their best songs. They played at Woodstock and at Monterey Pop. I believe they're at Monterey Pop. At least Woodstock, a San Francisco band, LA band in San Francisco. And he was a depressed guy, a lonely guy, and he was monkeying around with heroin, and they found him dead of an overdose in 1971, I believe, or 70 maybe, of heroin overdose. That's 27. So I don't know why 27 is it's got a curse on it. So now we're coming out of the 60s, going into the 70s. These deaths have happened. Music is changing now. It's getting bigger. It's getting more commercial. And so huge bands like Led Zeppelin led the way of the early 70s. Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd got huge. They recorded some mega hit records that were selling by the millions. Your favorite band with Ozzy, Black Sabbath, was recording. The music was getting heavier. It was before they termed it heavy metal, but heavy metal's on its way. These bands were kind of the forefathers of it, and it kind of started with Cream, which was a band with Eric Clapton, but it kind of really started in a way with the Kinks. They're kind of the godfathers because they're till the end of the day, and You Really Got Me has a heavy guitar sound, which is associated with heavy metal, but it has smart lyrics, unlike a lot of heavy metal. No offense for you heavy metal headbangers, but their lyrics are kind of on the dumb side. It's all about sex, drugs, and rock and roll with those boys and partying. Now, so here come the 70s, and in that mix, we've got singers like Iggy Stooge from the Stooges, which was a what they call punk band from Detroit, a savage punk, and he was really pretty big and popular. So was Lou Reed, who had led the Velvet Underground, which was a band that at the time hardly anybody paid attention to, but has been acknowledged as being another game-changing band that Lou and John Cale, Mo Tucker. I love the Velvet Underground. Their first 3 albums are genius, but nobody hardly bought them, but they influenced thousands and thousands of people. Lou was going solo. He was in England, didn't know what to do, so he ran into David Bowie, who was just getting big, and David Bowie produced Lou's record, and it hit big. And he had a hit called Walking on the Wild Side. David Bowie was an innovator, he didn't start glam rock, really. Who did was Mark Bolan from T-Rex, but David Bowie had the androgynous look. The guys liked him because he looked like a girl, and the girls liked him because he looked like a girl. You'd have to tell me why, ladies, if you're in the class, but some ladies like an androgynous-looking dude next to him, and he was definitely that. He attracted both sexes, and he was hugely influential in his music, especially the movie album Ziggy Stardust. Maybe heard of those songs, maybe haven't. And then he had a very healthy career for the next 35 years. He just died a couple years ago. Hard to believe he's dead. Really hard to believe. Lou Reed's dead too, by the way. Anyway, but the guys from Led Zeppelin are still alive. They just won't ever play together because Robert Plant doesn't want to play that music anymore. I don't blame him. It's youthful music, and he's 70 years old. He doesn't want to sing about baby, 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 love me till my juices are dried up. His juices are dried up, folks. I'm sorry to say. There's no more juice there. Anyway, um, these are huge band in the 70s. And then it became kind of glut. The 70s music became huge and corporate. Bands like Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and this thing called progressive rock, they call it prog rock, like bands like Yes. They were so proficient at their instruments, they're almost like jazz musicians, that most rock musicians couldn't keep up with them. That became hugely popular for a couple of years, and it left a lot of people in a lurch. I started losing my love for rock and roll because of those bands. They were too technically complicated for me to really get into. Um, Vishnu Orchestra. Um, and so I actually started listening to jazz in the mid 70s um, until a movement that saved my belief in rock and roll and a lot of people's belief, and they called it punk rock. Who spearheaded punk rock? Well, Americans say the Ramones started it, and British will say the Sex Pistols started it. But the Ramones had their album out first, and we had the New York Dolls and the Stooges and the MC5, which is evidently prototypical of punk rock, and then the Ramones, Patti Smith, Television, Talking Heads came out of that. I know you probably think Talking Heads is punk. Well, it was considered punk in the day, and they were all playing a little nightclub in New York City called CBGB, and it's just I've been there. It's a real shithole, but don't go in the bathroom. I mean, don't go in there. Anyway, but it was legendary because these bands didn't have a place to play in New York, and they played there. I got to talk fast now because I don't want this to go on too long, but it might go on a little longer than usual. Sorry about that, because I'm probably going to end on punk rock right now in a minute. And then in England, their punk was different than ours. Ours was kind of artistically angst-ridden artists who weren't being heard, and they're playing more simplistic music than the prog rock that was taking over everything. And plus, a thing that I loathe to this day, disco raised its ugly head, and it became hugely popular on the music charts and movies. You ever seen the John Travolta movies? I forget the name. Not Staying Alive, but the famous John Travolta movie that the Bee Gees wrote the soundtrack to. It's actually a really good movie. Not to take anything away from that movie, it's a really good movie. Bee Gees became huge. That kind of sound became huge, and then people like Donna Summer and so many more had these. Casey and the Sunshine Band, they had these kind of okay dance hits, and then there was this club in New York called Studio 54 where everybody was dancing their lights out, sucking up as much cocaine as they possibly could. Folks, there's live sex acts going on at Club 54. They had a gated door. You couldn't get in unless you were a beautiful person. If you look like me, you couldn't get in. I could work there though as a bartender. And so there was a person at the gate, and he would point, you could go in, you can't, you could go in. They only wanted the beautiful people in there. And so they had a mix like that. But at the same time, there's other clubs that were still very popular besides CBGB and Studio 54, the Mug Club and other places. And so New York was jumping with music, as was Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles, San Francisco. The youth were getting a lot of music, and it was great. It was awesome. Then in England, we had the Sex Pistols and the Clash, and maybe you've heard of the Sex Pistols, maybe you've heard of the Clash, hopefully. Other bands, a ton of other bands over there, Susie and the Banshees, the Slits, the Raincoats. Generation X. Anyway, some of my favorite British punk bands coming out of that era. And they changed. Once again, they're changing the scenery. The fashions changed. The punks in America were all wearing black leather jackets and holes in their pants and Converse tennis shoes. The punks over there were dressing a little bit better, and a lot of them were putting in the safety pins in their cheeks and their ear and their lips and their nose. We didn't really do that here. That was a fashion statement that was coming out of England, but it was influencing everything. Guess what, folks? It literally killed disco. Thank you very much. These guys are all my age. Hard to believe. Joe Strummer, if you don't know who that is, he was the lead singer and the front man of the Clash. He's actually a year older than me, but we're born in the same month, I think. Anyway, he died tragically at 50 of a heart attack. He's been dead quite a few years, and he was, to me, the John Lennon of punk rock, which means he was somebody you needed to listen to. Not just his music, but you needed to listen to his interviews. He was a visionary, but he was very much the punk. They abused themselves mostly with cigarettes and alcohol and heroin, of course. Sex Pistols were famous for having Sid Vicious as their bass player, who got, after the Sex Pistols broke up, the dark side of punk reared its ugly head. And Sid was living in New York with his girlfriend, Nancy. And in a drug-fueled episode, no one's ever going to find out what really happened. Sid supposedly stuck a knife in Nancy's stomach. She bled to death on the bathroom floor. He went out after she bled to death looking for more heroin because he wanted to get high. They arrested him for murder, charged him with murder. He was on Rikers Island, and the time he was on Rikers Island, you just go cold turkey. They don't care that you're a drug addict. You will go cold turkey even though it could kill you. He came out a couple of weeks later. They bailed him out. He was going to stand trial. He had a homecoming party that his mother actually threw. His friends were there, and what's Sid want for his birthday? He wants a bunch of heroin. Mom gave it to him. Well, Sid hadn't shot up in several weeks, and so if you know anything about drugs, if you are clean of drugs, but you'd been on drugs before, heroin especially, you don't go back to the same amount you were doing. If you're doing a lot because you've worked your way up to it, like Sid had, you don't do a lot to start off again. Well, Sid did a lot, it killed it. So Sid was dead. I'm trying to think of his age right now. 22, maybe? Maybe he's only 19. He was a kid, folks. I'd have to Google it. They made a pretty good movie that Johnny Rotten hates, but I like, called Sid and Nancy. I thought it was a decent movie. If you guys are in my movie class, we'd be talking about it. Anyway, so another death happened. That's New York Dolls, and I'm going to shut up. The New York Dolls was an influential band that kind of was a glam band in New York. They dressed up like women. Yes, they did, but they, for the most part, they were heterosexual guys, but they dressed in drag, sort of, and they became hugely popular in New York. Nowhere else in the country, really. In England, they were popular, and a guy by the name of Johnny Thunders was their guitar player. He was a kid from the Bronx, a New Yorker all the way, and after during the band, he became a severe heroin addict. That's what helped break the band up. The drummer, Jerry Nolan, was a severe heroin addict, and David Johansen was not, and so he's the singer, and they were gone. And that kind of ended that great band. Later on, Johnny Thunders could not stop his habit. He had a solo career, solo career in 1991 or so. He was trying to clean up. He moved to New Orleans. He took another shot of heroin, and he died. A year later, within 6 months, the drummer, Jerry Nolan, died of drug abuse. He had all sorts of meningitis and everything else that was brought on by 30 years of severe drug abuse. Drugs kill, folks. Eventually, you will die of it. I just read a book about, and the main character was, you probably don't know this grunge band, Screaming Trees, and he was shooting up heroin with Kurt Cobain and Lane Stanley from one of my favorite bands of the grunge era, Alice in Chains. Kurt essentially he was a junkie forever. Before he died, he took a huge shot of heroin to try to kill himself. Then he put a shotgun in his mouth. That will do it, folks. Also, Lane, he ended up ODing in about 2003 or something. He couldn't stop shooting up. I think he had made 40, I believe. Maybe not. Anyway, I just read the book. I can't remember. But maybe you know those bands. Alice in Chains, great grunge band. Lane is a great singer. He just was a junkie, which was a popular thing in Seattle in those days. Okay, enough of this junkie talk. I'm going to assign your fourth essay. It's going to be about a musician. You are going to have to research this musician. I'm going to make the list. It's going to be, you're going to have a choice. And I'm going to try to cover all the ages we've covered, except for I have not covered so much. I can't cover it all. We've got to go off music. But so I want to go back to classical. I'll post this all tonight. You can write a paper about Mozart. This is going to be a 3-page research paper, but it's a critical research paper. You're just not telling me when they were born and when they died. You've seen the documentary. I posted it. Maybe you have to do some more research. Try to get a feel on why Mozart was a game changer. Try to maybe listen to his music. You're going to have a whole week to write this paper. Get to know Mozart on not just a superficial level of when he lived and when he died. Okay, that's fine. But what made him tick? What made his music stay? If you want, you could take one piece of music and critically analyze it. Are you up to it? Do you think it's too scary? Have you ever listened to Mozart? Maybe it's a good time to do it. The other one would be, I'm going to try to go through decades here. The other one is a jazz musician who changed everything. I talked about him during jazz when I did jazz a couple weeks ago, Miles Davis. Once again, research Miles Davis. Find out what made him tick. Why was he so influential? The other one would be the 60s. You got to do the Beatles, folks. Whether you like it or not, and you know you do. Why? What made them tick? Why such a phenomenon? This is a 3-page paper at least. You could go over 3 pages, of course. Now you're going to need a works cited page because you're going to get this information somewhere. I need to know where you got it. You can either watch documentaries wherever on whatever your sources are, or you got to read about it online, not just Wikipedia. I don't want you to quote everything out of Wikipedia because that's just a lightweight version of who these people are. I'd rather you guys listen to one of their songs and dissect that song. I'd rather have you do that than give me some thumbnail sketch of when John Lennon and Paul McCartney were children, what high school they went to. I don't care. I want to know about their music and how their music had this effect on the world, and it still does. Same thing with Mozart, believe it or not, same thing with Miles Davis. You might not know that. Miles is still very much in the culture. Rap groups, hip hop, they all quote in stuff from Miles Davis's past. We're going to go to the 70s. I'm going to jump over Led Zeppelin. I'm going to go to punk. I'm going to say The Clash. Okay, why? Why The Clash? Then I'm going to jump over the 80s, and there's some great bands in the 80s, folks. My favorite bands would be REM and the DBs, B-52s, Jeffrey Lee Pierce and the Gun Club. I'm leaving out the whole punk era in LA, which I lived through with these great groups like X and the Germs and so many more. I just can't cover it all. Then we're going to go to the 90s grunge. Let's just go to the main guy. There was Screaming Trees, there was Nirvana, Pearl Jam, so many more. L7 didn't come out of grunge, but they kind of got pushed into that grunge scene. Courtney Love's band, which I love, You can make your paper on Nirvana. You could take an album. You could take an overall view of who they were, what they meant to the culture. And then the third, I'm going to get into, I'm sorry, I can't get up there all the way. Influential band when it came to rap music, hip hop music, a band I respect. Maybe you've never heard of them because they're not the usual Eminem and stuff, who I totally think is fine. I don't have a problem with it. But it's the Wu-Tang Clan, a collective of really innovative beat artists, rappers, poets. Maybe you've heard of them, maybe you haven't. I hope you haven't. So that when you research them, you'll see how influential that they have on all hip hop and rap bands. I'm going to stop it there. I'll list all this stuff. Give me a day or two to post everything. I'll probably have another thing on a documentary on rock and roll. Maybe I'll just have a punk rock era. Maybe that'll. Hey, I like to torture with that one. So you have to watch that. This will be in, you know where it is, on Canvas. And then I'm going to post the assignments. In assignments, I'll do that hopefully tonight after I eat my dinner. And you guys will have a week to do the paper and have fun with it. Music is really, really fun. And it changes everything. Hopefully you guys are listening to music. If we're in the class right now, I'd go around and say, what are you listening to? How do you listen to it? Is it in the background or do you got your headphones on? Is it something you actively engage in, or if it's always in the background? That's fine. Look, folks, this is right next to my TV. Can you read it? Where is it? Let me see if I can get it. I don't know if you can read that or not. You know what this button says? Punk is not dead. Punk is a way of doing things. You could be a punk novelist, a punk painter, a punk dancer, a punk a poet. It means you're doing it authentically and you're doing it yourself. You're not depending on others. You're not depending on some record company to make your band. You're recording your own band, your own music. You're writing your own poetry. You're publishing it. You're reading at open mics. It's DIY, do it yourself. And that's what the beautiful thing about punk is. It's a way of doing all art. You could be a punk carpenter if you're doing some interesting creative building your own way without just following all the rules that everybody else follows. Okay, kids. Students, thank you for putting up with this. My longest lecture yet. I'm tired. I'll post all this. See you next week. Bye. Shit.